Some experts say there's a lack of domestic violence programs, shelters, and resources in the U.S. to help LGBTQ+ victims.
But the advocates found a call for greater equality so queer abuse victims don't feel like they have nowhere to go. Queer victims of domestic violence often face setbacks, stigmas, and stereotypes.
Domestic violence as a concept is very gendered in everyone's mind in society. We think of a man abusing a woman, and queer people think the same. And if we don't start talking about that, queer people won't be able to realize that their experience fits into this paradigm of domestic violence.
Jacob De Vera is the Director of Development and Community-Based Programs at Women's Advocates. The organization helps victim survivors of all genders and sexualities escape domestic violence.
Queer people are consistently seeking shelter and resources for domestic violence, even if they might not have the vocabulary to name their experience as domestic violence.
The first step is recognizing the abuse. And sometimes abusive situations will often be described as toxic relationships. How does using phrases that can sometimes glaze over or downplay what's really happening, impact those who are in these situations?
We're always talking about friends, lovers who have dramatic relationships, or like this relationship is toxic, that relationship is toxic, they did this thing, etc. But what that covers up, I think, is real violence and real trauma that people are experiencing in their relationships, and the fact remains that a lot of these dramatic relationships are actually abusive, but we avoid using that terminology because our relationships define us, who we are as queer people.
Sometimes police don't even recognize queer domestic violence.
The most common thing that happens when if the police are called and it is an LGBTQ couple, it's two women or two men, they are not going to read that violence as, oh, this is domestic violence, this is spousal violence, this is family violence.
Many domestic violence shelters and programs are geared towards women and children. That leaves queer victims nowhere to go. How does the lack of specialized shelters contribute to life-threatening situations for queer victims?
That's something fundamental that a lot of domestic violence shelters are contending with right now. Because we'll get phone calls, and even though the federal government tells us that we have to serve everyone regardless of gender, they might not be comfortable calling us because of our historical associations with being a women's shelter. The more often this happens, the more often we get people calling and they just don't feel comfortable coming to our shelter. So we need alternative service models that cater to queer people who are in violent relationships. We need more shelter space specifically for LGBTQ individuals. If a person is in mortal danger, if they're scared for their life, if they are fleeing violence, they don't have any place to go besides living on the streets, entering homelessness, besides staying with their abusive partner, entering drug treatment, but they don't have a place to go where they can just get away from a violent situation. And that's going to lead to deaths, assaults, and abuse.
And for trans victims of domestic violence, seeking help can be especially challenging.
Trans people face some of the highest rates of gender-based violence. All of this is part of societal transphobia and is a problem, but in crisis, that trans person needs to find safety quickly, and sometimes coming to a shelter and dealing with all the institutional transphobia of a shelter isn't the way to do it. The dynamics of power control that exist in abusive relationships need to be treated head on with therapy, healing, and the mental health services that we provide at a domestic violence shelter. And too often LGBTQ folks are totally skip over the shelter services and the DV services because no one recognizes their experiences as domestic violence.
How have your life experiences personally and professionally influenced your approach to addressing domestic violence within the LGBTQ community?
I am a survivor of domestic violence, and I didn't find out until I started working in a domestic violence shelter that, oh, wait, the trauma that every participant who enters our program experiences every day is the same trauma I went through, but these services were not available and were not offered to me because I am a queer man and my LGBTQ identity did not fit into the picture of domestic violence that we normally see. And that to me meant that we need to do something differently. Like, we need to talk to law enforcement. We need to be on the ground at treatment centers. We need to be working with our LGBTQ community. We need to be at gay bars talking about relationship violence, what it looks like, and that there are services specifically to help you get out of it.
We want to say thank you again for your insight and for your vulnerability that you shared with our audience today. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information on women's advocates, go to wadvocates.org. We've discussed such important life-saving topics in our show. And remember, if you're in an abusive relationship and feel like you have nowhere to go, there are groups that want to help advocate for you.
The contact information for the National Domestic Violence Hotline is on the screen. All calls are confidential. Thanks so much for tuning in to our special episode of The Advocates. For more stories, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Our handle is Advocate Channel. You can always find us at advocatechannel.com.